But I have the great privilege of talking about Laura Bush. Now, for four of us that are here today, Kristen, Myra, myself, and who's talking about, Rosalind? Kristen is talking about Rosalind. Who's talking about Hillary? Yes, Jeanette. Um, so we have it a little bit harder because we're talking about first ladies who are still alive. These are women who can speak for themselves. So they're available to critique what we have to say. So we're doing our best and trying to be as dispassionate, of course, as possible from the scholarly point of view. But I am in a unique position on this because not only are these first ladies still alive, but I worked for this First Lady very directly and intimately over a number of years and know this family very well. But I wanted to start by saying on January 17th, 2001, after a historic period of electoral uncertainty that followed the November 2000 presidential election, President-elect and Mrs. George W. Bush stood on the platform in Centennial Plaza in Midland, Texas, bidding adieu to their home state before moving to Washington, D.C. to begin their life in the White House. And you see these photos there. The send-off was very poignant for both of them and for the country. After 5 weeks, of course, we didn't know who the President of the United States was going to be. But 8 years later, just hours after watching his successor being sworn in, the former President and First Lady were home in Texas. And they stopped first in Midland, the ideal backdrop to mark the beginning and the end of their White House journey. A reminder of how much that city and their deep Texas roots mean to them. As President Bush so aptly cited in his memoir, Decision Points, many of the faces in the crowd were the same, a reminder of true friends who were with us before politics, during politics, and after politics. The setting was equally resonant for Laura Bush, whose character and values were shaped by the people and plains of West Texas. Her experiences as a child of the boom and bust town of Midland helped inform her choices and her worldview over the entire course of her life. The woman who became a truly global First Lady was constantly guided by the lessons she first learned in West Texas. Laura Bush's own words about her childhood convey the quiet strength and resilience for which she is so well known. Her calm, soft-spoken manner, characteristics she has exhibited throughout her life, have especially provided the direction or the compass for her historic journey in the tumultuous world of politics and life alongside the more outspoken George W. Bush. As she wrote in her memoir, Spoken from the Heart, it helped to be fearless if you lived in Midland. It wasn't so much an insular world, but an isolated one. Aside from neighboring Odessa, any town of consequence was at least a 2-hour drive away. It was both isolated and challenging. The wind and the sand were things you lived with. If you were born there, you never knew anything else. But if you moved there, it must have seemed sometimes like a land forsaken. Land in West Texas was challenging, but the wide open sky was inspiring, and the potential was entrancing. The Midland spirit, Mrs. Bush noted, really has something to do with the landscape because the sky is so huge. There's a real feeling of unlimited possibilities here. The way she writes about one of her favorite memories in Spoken from the Heart conveys her sense of wonder of a world beyond Midland. Mother and I love the sky. Above us, the constellations hung like strands of Christmas lights, waiting to be plucked. Lying beside me on the blanket, my mother pointed out to Orion, the Little Dipper, and the planets, the glowing pink of Venus, or the distant fire of Jupiter, and she would say, "Laura, look at the sky, look up." Laura Bush was influenced by these surroundings in which she was raised, but even more, she was influenced by the character of the people she knew, people she would be friends with for decades, and with whom she shared her evolution into a public life, as the send-off and welcoming rallies in Centennial Plaza attest. She marries the landscape with the character of its residents, saying, and I quote, "There's a certain wide openness about the space, but also about the people." According to Mrs. Bush, people in West Texas believe that they think differently, and to a large degree they do. There is a plainness to the way West Texas looks that translates into how people act and what they value. Those who live there are direct and blunt. There is no time for artifice. It looks and sounds ridiculous amid the barren landscape. The West Texas plains were seared on each of us like an invisible brand. She commented in a Good Morning America interview in May 2002, "Texans are risk takers. All the businesses that Texas was founded on all depend on other things than your own hard work, including the weather and your luck. It's difficult to settle for women as well as men. I think that's why Texas is known for so many strong women." Laura Bush used her own formative Texas strength to forge an agenda to benefit people in her home state, and later for all Americans. The one picture that's in the left corner, I just want to point out to you, because this is something Texas has that no other state in the Union has. This is the boyhood home of George W. Bush. It's the only historic site in the country that's home to 2 presidents, 2 governors, and a first lady. It's on track to become a National Historic Site through the Park Service. So write your congressman, because that's how it'll happen. Laura Bush used her own formative Texas strength, as I said, to form an agenda to benefit people here in Texas and for all Americans when she became First Lady. Using her lifelong love of reading, Laura Bush advocated for the importance of literacy and education reform in her public life. As a child, she saw reading as an escape from her isolated hometown and found a world awaiting her in books. As a teacher and then a librarian in economically disadvantaged areas of Houston, Austin, and Dallas, her experiences shaped her belief that literacy and education are more than an escape into a faraway world. They are vehicles for children to survive in the real world and to overcome discrimination. As with so many young people coming of age in the turbulent civil rights era, the images Laura Bush saw on the news also ignited a desire to foster change. She says, "The scenes from the Alabama marches or the riots that left Detroit and Newark in flames cemented my desire to do what I could, and that was to teach in an inner city minority school. I wanted to work with children who had been left out and too often left behind simply because of the color of their skin." Laura Bush's advocacy was not fleeting. Here she's a student at SMU. This is where she got her education degree. Her advocacy was not fleeting. Her time as a teacher in public schools across Texas with a majority number of minority students opened her eyes to a part of the world she had not seen in segregated Midland. She later decided to become a librarian to promote literacy and books as a way to improve students' lives. Laura Bush worked in the library at the Molly Dawson Elementary School in Austin after getting her library science degree, the graduate degree from the University of Texas. Molly Dawson Elementary was in the barrio on the east side, in almost an entirely Spanish-speaking school. At Longfellow Elementary in Dallas, teaching fourth grade, the students were bussed in from other neighborhoods close to downtown. Most came from a predominantly African American neighborhood near the Parkland Hospital, where John F. Kennedy was rushed after he was shot. She later taught fourth grade in Houston at John F. Kennedy Elementary School. The students, nearly all of whom were African American, lived for the most part in small town, rundown houses behind the school building. As a librarian at Kashmere Gardens Neighborhood Library in Houston, in an African American section of the city, Mrs. Bush found herself in a unique position. As she recounts it, instead of businessmen looking for mystery novels, I helped families find books. And as soon as school ended, we were overrun with children who had nowhere else safe to go. I was their de facto caregiver. On one occasion, when Laura Bush was teaching in Houston, her students were going on a field trip, and the bus was picking them up at their houses. When they arrived at one particular house, Mrs. Bush's student, a little boy, opened the door. Yet his mother would not come to the door, nor give permission for him to go. Laura Bush has never forgotten this moment or that little boy. It broke her heart to leave him behind. She publicly speaks of that experience frequently as a pivotal point for her and as a reminder of coming face to face with a child who did not have a chance to experience life and to learn. These experiences in Texas schools would inspire and motivate her and would be crucial to her role as First Lady of Texas when she was called on by Governor George W. Bush's education policy advisors to help develop sweeping education reform in Texas. She convened a summit on early childhood development and brain research, inviting top experts from around the nation to discuss the importance of reading from infancy and family literacy as ways to prepare students for learning years before they were enrolled in school. Her motivation went back to the early days in her career as she remembered her kids all those years ago at Longfellow and John F. Kennedy and Dawson, and wondered how their lives might have been different if they had come through the school doors ahead rather than from behind. The experts who came to her summit in Texas were dazzled that she was so well informed and so interested in cutting-edge research, the brain science to unlock pathways for how small children can learn. The findings from her summit contributed to Senate Bill 955 and marked the first time Laura Bush had pursued her own legislative agenda, which resulted in $17 million in funding directed towards preparing preschoolers for the learning rigors of elementary school and beyond. She would become a champion for school children across the country when she became First Lady of the United States. Remembering everything these children needed in Texas, she knew there would be similarities across the country. Prior to moving into the White House in 2001, Mrs. Bush said her goal as First Lady would be introducing children to the magic of words. Spreading the joy of reading became the foundation of her official agenda, both at home and abroad. Well, if I'm going to be a public figure, she said, I might as well do what I've always liked doing, which meant acting like a librarian and getting people interested in reading. When she moved into the Texas governor's mansion, her first act as First Lady was to invite a group of Texas authors to read at an inaugural week event. Then she began traveling the state to focus attention on literacy and encourage better reading programs for children. Mrs. Bush founded the first Texas Book Festival in November 1996. I love this picture. The proceeds from the 3-day event were earmarked for Texas public libraries to help expand library collections and other library materials. Since its founding, the Texas Book Festival has donated nearly $3 million to Texas public libraries through approximately 355 grants awarded to libraries in every geographic region of Texas, equivalent to 75% of all of the libraries in this state. When she arrived at the White House in 2001, Mrs. Bush would partner with the Library of Congress and adapt the Texas model to launch a book festival on the national stage. The National Book Festival, now in its 18th year, quite a legacy, draws more than 200,000 book lovers and over 100 authors annually from all across the country. Her passion for books and commitment to improved educational outcomes was well known at home and became the focus of her work around the world. Her foreign travel itinerary focused on education and literacy programs for women and children, especially girls. When the United States re-entered the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, in 2003, the UN Secretary General soon asked Laura Bush to help lead a literacy initiative in support of the UN's Millennium Development Goals and asked her to serve as the honorary ambassador for UN's Decade of Literacy. She hosted the first ever White House Conference on Global Literacy in 2006 to encourage international cooperation in this issue. She hosted this conference in New York during the annual meeting of the UN General Assembly, or UNGA, in order to achieve the largest possible attendance of her counterparts from around the world, to learn from leaders and innovators in the field of literacy and education. Also, as First Lady of Texas, Mrs. Bush continually drew on more of her formative experiences growing up in West Texas. She was very conscious of seeking ways to strengthen smaller communities through conservation and historic preservation. She made it a priority to visit the Texas Main Street program cities. She remembers visiting those towns and, in many cases, walking the main street around their courthouse and seeing those cities that tried in many ways to revitalize their small downtowns as people moved out and mom and pop stores closed. At the center of life for many of these communities in the South was the county courthouse. It was integral to the identity of towns all across Texas, and indeed to identity of the American South. And it held a special place in the memories of Mrs. Bush's childhood. She recalled, "Everyone who's my age really remembers the courthouse in their town. In fact, when I was younger, people used to drive around the county courthouse square on Friday nights. That's just what kids did, especially in smaller towns that didn't have a drive-in restaurant like Midland did." Mrs. Bush, how simple and how lovely that must have been, right? Mrs. Bush's memories of the courthouse in Midland compelled her to protect them as First Lady of Texas. According to the Texas Historical Commission, Texas has more historic courthouses than any other state. 235 are still in active government use, and some dating back from as far back as the mid-19th century. They were among some of the first permanent structures in many Texas counties. Her advocacy for courthouses made a difference. In 1998, Texas county courthouses were added to the National Trust's 11 Most Endangered Places list. Texas also created the Texas Historic Courthouse Preservation Program, the largest preservation grant program ever initiated by a state government. Mrs. Bush's interest in preserving the courthouses was also partly due to her love of history. It seems like reading history has been part of my life my whole life. Texans are very proud of their history. We learn the names of the early characters in our history. In Midland, our elementary schools were named for heroes of the Alamo. Our junior highs were named for the Battle of Texas Revolutions. History was just something we grew up with. Preserving historical treasures was an interest that the First Lady of Texas would bring with her to the White House, and it would become a significant feature of her agenda as U.S. First Lady. She championed the Preserve America initiative, signed by President George W. Bush as an executive order in 2003. The preservation effort dispersed grants to support community efforts to protect America's priceless cultural and natural heritage assets. Mrs. Bush traveled to Preserve America sites around the country, in the Midwest, the Northeast, and the South, to award these grants. More than $21 million in matching grants was awarded to 280 projects throughout the country from 2006 to 2010. Mrs. Bush also continued to support Save America's Treasures, an initiative started by her predecessor, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who founded it in 1999 on the eve of the millennium to protect key historical sites as well as priceless artifacts, including the Star-Spangled Banner. On July 12, 2007, President Bush proposed the Preserve America and Save America's Treasures Act, bringing these two initiatives from two administrations, from two different political parties together. This legislation would ensure the government's continued ability to protect America's historic places, objects, and collections for years to come. President Barack Obama signed it into law in March 2009. Mrs. Bush also undertook a significant restoration of the White House when she became U.S. First Lady, and again, her life in Midland was instrumental. As she explained to Architectural Digest in March 2008, she always had a love of houses and design. "I'd like houses, and I'd like decorating," she said. "My father was a home builder in Midland. He built spec houses for all those people in the oil business. And of course, he built all the houses we lived in. He worked at home, so all of his plans were there, and I was very aware of what he was doing." She also had the unique opportunity to get to know the White House in ways no other First Lady had, as a daughter-in-law of a president and First Lady. During President George H.W. Bush's administration, Laura Bush and George W. Bush would visit the White House many times and stay in different rooms. One of her fondest memories is when she had the opportunity to walk around the state floor at night when it was quiet, after dinner, when no one else was there. With my mother-in-law, we would go from room to room, turn on the lights, and really have a chance to study them. When she set out to restore the Lincoln bedroom on the second floor of the White House, Mrs. Bush, along with the White House curator, the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, and the White House Historical Association, knew they wanted the Lincoln bedroom to accurately reflect its time, the 1850s and the 1860s, rather than furnished with the items in the room from the 20th century that were there. Mrs. Bush and her team used documentary evidence from the period to make it historically accurate to represent the room's history as it was for President Lincoln's office. In addition to education and historic preservation, Laura Bush's interest in conservation was reflected in her appreciation for another First Lady from Texas, Claudia Lady Bird Johnson. "I had always admired Lady Bird," she said, the first Texas First Lady, and had been so proud that she had recognized the great natural beauty of our home state and nation. "When we drive our vast highways past waving grasses and blooming flowers, acres of bluebonnets or black-eyed Susans or Queen Anne's lace. That is the legacy of Lady Bird's touch, of how she worked to beautify America with native plants and wildflowers. Mrs. Johnson's legacy inspired Laura Bush and her conservation agenda. That idea of conservation in my home in West Texas, where you really do need to conserve. There's very little water, she says. It's drought. And the only plants and trees that do well are the ones that are native, that are used to that kind of dry, arid landscape. The White House walls did not limit Mrs. Bush's love of nature and the outdoors. She had already begun the tradition of an annual hiking trip with friends in 1986 to the Grand Canyon. Many of those friends she had met in Midland, a ritual she continued throughout her time as First Lady, and that she continues today, every year hiking in another national park. In 2005, she took her love of nature and passion for education and agreed to be honorary chair of the National Park Foundation, where she was actively involved in the Junior Ranger program to ensure younger generations would explore and take pride in our national parks. She launched an initiative in 2007 in honor of Lady Bird Johnson called First Bloom to encourage kids to connect to nature, especially in urban settings, and learn about conservation and about native plants and invasive species. Upon returning home to Texas after the White House, Mrs. Bush helped found Texan by Nature, launched in 2011 to amplify and encourage existing conservation projects and bring conservation groups, communities, and businesses together to achieve results. The organization, with its 57 conservation partners across this state, has already had an impact. In its role as a connector and catalyst, Texan by Nature is working to build a culture of conservation and partnership that benefits all Texans. In addition, the Bushes have worked to restore a natural prairie at their ranch in Crawford and have planted native wild grasses in the area around the George W. Bush Presidential Center here at SMU. If you haven't been to the library exhibit yet on First Ladies, please go and see it, but then also and see the wonderful library. Thank you, Pat Mordente, as well, for being a partner to this great conference. I really appreciate that. And to Natalie Ganella-Platts, who was instrumental in working with the library to develop this wonderful exhibit on First Ladies. But behind the library are these beautiful, there's the Texas Native Natural Prairie. And you will love, particularly on a day as the weather gets better, make sure your walk experience you won't forget, I promise you. Both Laura and George Bush expected to focus on domestic initiatives when they arrived in the White House. As she neared the end of her first year as First Lady, Laura Bush had hosted a successful summit on early childhood cognitive development at Georgetown University. She had held that first National Book Festival. She and her husband had held the administration's first state dinner for the President of Mexico, reflecting the important relationship between Mexico and their home state of Texas. But on September 11th, 2001, Laura Bush was headed to Capitol Hill to brief the Senate's Education Committee on the findings of her education summit. The events of that day changed history, as well as her life as First Lady. Mrs. Bush wrote in her memoir, "I was anxious, but I was never fearful, and I received so many forms of unsolicited comfort. My old roommate from Houston told me on the phone that the whole time you've been in Washington, Laura, I've been so glad that I wasn't you. And I didn't have to do what you're doing." Then she went on, "But now I'm jealous for the first time because you can do something after this horrible tragedy." And as Laura Bush says, I could do things that could make a difference. That was my solace. As the country's outlook changed, So did Laura Bush's agenda. I think American women were shocked after September 11th when the spotlight turned on Afghanistan and we saw a country where women were brutalized and were marginalized. And what we saw in a country where half of the population is left out is a failed country. And that's what Afghanistan was. Dr. Condoleezza Rice, here we are in Afghanistan, actually on Mrs. Bush's first trip in March of 2005. That was planned in a secret, and where she had the opportunity to meet with women, as you see here in the upper left corner, that were now living in a dormitory, safely being educated, and a dormitory just for women. And with children who now, in March 2005, the children on the right are from a program called Ashiana. This group of children were now going to school for the first time in their lives. An entire generation of education was lost on women and girls in that country. Dr. Condoleezza Rice, George Bush's first national security advisor, has noted that 9/11 was a turning point for Laura when she became more involved in foreign policy. It was Laura's idea, Rice explained, to fully and completely expose what the Taliban regime was doing to women, emphasizing the violations of women's rights. When you think about it, it's natural for the United States to speak out on women's rights. And it turned out to be hugely important in terms of broadening the base of support for the war in Afghanistan, in terms of really vivifying for people what this regime was like. Among her projects, Mrs. Bush drew on her belief that education is transformative, and she worked to try and provide Afghan textbooks to schools and encouraged all Americans, especially children, to send money through the America's Fund for Afghan Children, a fund that raised more than $9 million. I'm fortunate to have been able to be here to help. I can speak out. I can support relief efforts. I've met with Afghan women who are teachers, lawyers, judges, human rights workers, and parliamentarians. I have traveled to Kabul to help with the opening of the American University of Afghanistan, what you see here, and the creation of the Women's Teacher Training Institute to train female teachers from rural provinces. And I have met with women brave enough to become police officers. Mrs. Bush could not have predicted that she would find her most important global role as First Lady when she was a sixth grader at James Bowie Elementary School in Midland. She did her research for a class assignment that her teacher, Mr. Bain, told us to look at a map of the world, and I ran my finger around and picked the crossing point for the ancient Silk Road. And so my sixth grade country report was on Afghanistan, a nation I never thought that I would encounter again, much less visit 3 times as First Lady. She chose Afghanistan then because she wanted to pick a country that sounded completely exotic and remote compared to anything I knew in Midland, Texas. Now, in 2001, with Afghanistan's regime at the center of the terrorist attack on the United States, Laura Bush became the first First Lady to deliver solo the weekly presidential radio address, telling a vastly different story about this ancient country. When I had put the headphones and bent over the microphone to read the address, I had thought of those Afghan women weighted down under their burqas with nothing more than tiny mesh slits to uncover their eyes, hidden away from the world and having the world hidden away from them. They were truly powerless. At that moment, it was not that I found my voice. Instead, it was as if my voice found me. All her endeavors and their wide range illustrate Mrs. Bush's natural ability to reach across the aisle. She was able to work with people who may not have shared her politics, but they recognized and appreciated her depth of knowledge and commitment to issues in which she was involved. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, she worked with many local leaders in the Gulf Coast, including Louisiana's then Democratic Lieutenant Governor Mitch Landrieu, to help rebuild the many schools and libraries damaged or destroyed by the hurricane, making more than 20 trips to the region after the hurricane. Mrs. Bush also focused on the military oppression of the people of Burma. She was a consistent critic of the military junta and demonstrated a deep commitment to the crisis in Burma, using her platform to convene a roundtable at the United Nations, publish op-eds, hold briefings with the UN Special Envoy, join the Senate Women's Caucus on Burma, led by Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein and Republican Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson. She met with Burmese exiles and refugees and visited the refugee camps on the Thai-Burma border. She also became the First Lady to conduct a press conference from the White House press briefing room, where she called on the Burmese regime to allow humanitarian assistance to enter the country after the devastating Cyclone Nargis. Mrs. Bush's contributions have been widely recognized. As Hillary Clinton said at her Senate confirmation hearing for Secretary of State, Mrs. Bush has been outspoken on behalf of the plight of Afghan women and other women facing oppression around the world. According to Michelle Bernard, then president of the Independent Women's Forum, Mrs. Bush has done a phenomenal job of addressing issues that are important in a graceful way, in a way that has had an impact on the lives of millions of women all over the world. Whether her work was in Africa or Southeast Asia or in the Middle East, we have seen this First Lady go out and tackle huge issues that are of grave importance to women, not only at home, but abroad. With AIDS and HIV, which you see here, a group of women from South Africa, from the Mothers to Mothers program, presented a commemorative T-shirt to Mrs. Bush. And I think at that event, they actually called her Mama Laura or Grandma Laura. She wasn't a grandma yet, so it was definitely very moving for her to have these women with HIV come to the White House. But whether it was on this issue or breast cancer awareness, I think of this again, this is Michelle Bernard. I think her legacy, when the history books are written, will be that she has been a graceful advocate for women's rights and democracy promotion through education in countries all over the world. For the former teacher librarian from the plains of West Texas, her efforts were bold. In her journey, Laura Bush drew on that formative Texas strength to forge an agenda that made a difference for the citizens in her home state, for the country, and for people around the world. And wherever Mrs. Bush went, the Midland spirit, with its real feeling of unlimited possibilities, followed her. In conclusion, I will share one memorable experience on our travels together. Just was her idea. She saw the camel, said, let's go. Where I witnessed firsthand, this is the incredible privilege I feel. I've had a front row seat of having worked in 3 different presidential administrations and with 3 different first ladies, but really so closely with Laura Bush as her chief of staff. On this beautiful day in Petra, Jordan, in late October 2007, as we traveled on these camels with the U.S. ambassador to Jordan, Mrs. Bush meandered through the twisting, narrow gorge that surrounds the ancient city and its rose-colored walls. Much of the city has lain silent since the 300s, when an earthquake struck. But it is still possible to imagine the people who once made their homes amid this cavernous stone. As she rounded one final bend, she intersected with a group of American tourists who turned out were from her beloved home state. She was as surprised as they were, And immediately upon seeing her, they made the sign of hook 'em horns and began singing The Eyes of Texas. In a world away, Laura Bush was still the girl from the heart of Texas. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't, if anybody has a question. It was a long speech.
We do have time for some questions. There's a microphone in the back. I would encourage you not to do the Texas Longhorn salute.
I know, not with Mustangs, sorry. Pony up, though. I have a son that goes to school here. Anybody have any questions? It was sort of, I tried to give a really broad view of her background in Texas, but also her work as First Lady of this state and of the nation. I think was an interesting comment that was made before about looking at other women leaders in our history who have made these incredible contributions and talking about spouses of governors. That's an incredible opportunity for First Ladies of the nation to have had that platform and learn the opportunity that they have to use the office. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to entertain them. And I do want to introduce, I think I said Natalie Ganella-Platts, who runs the Women's Initiative at the Bush Center, who's doing a wonderful series of podcasts now examining our First Lady. So she may be tapping some of you here to talk to her. No questions? Oh, yes, Natalie. Sure. Right. Sure. Yeah. Natalie brought up a really good question, and that is really fundamentally important to a First Lady having a successful platform, is being able to work with the president's team. Because the East and the West Wing, are divided by that beautiful, big, expansive lawn. But you certainly don't want the relationship between the two staffs to have the light of day. Where Mrs. Bush really felt, and when I interviewed with her for the position of Chief of Staff, she was very clear to me on a couple of points. One thing she said, I want to go to Afghanistan. So I thought this is going to be a very different experience. And my first question back to her was, does the president know? And she said yes, and he supports it. Because I knew, and at Natalie's point, from also having been a former staff member on the west side of the House, that those assets that are needed to be able to execute an incredibly complex, dangerous trip like that would never have happened if the president did not say, I want Laura to do this and make everything available to her, all the assets that are needed to do it. To your question about PEPFAR, the AIDS Relief Initiative, this is to this day is the largest relief effort, largest contribution to a single disease in history. It was a $15 billion commitment in 2003, and 5 years later was re-upped for $30 billion. It's the generosity of the American people that Laura Bush was out there talking about when we went to Africa, 15 different countries, 5 different trips, talking about PEPFAR and the results and bringing those messages back home, not only to the president, but to the American people. She was his diplomat. She was his advocate. She was his voice. She was the face of all of you, of all of us, of American generosity. The results being 11 million lives on the continent of Africa have been saved. And that was the message Laura Bush was trying to promote on behalf of the administration, behalf of her husband, but really on behalf of the country. So everything that we engaged in, all of the policy initiatives, whether they were domestic or global, we're all completely intertwined and effective, and we worked effectively with our counterparts on the West, in the West Wing, including to the point with all the global travel Laura Bush did, 67 countries in the second term, 77 overall in her 8 years. The National Security Advisor then at the time, Steve Hadley, just asked me to become a member of his team, of the Senior Directorate, to be part of the planning of these events. So again, another example of the integration between the two staffs. In my mind, that's where it's most successful. The First Lady can pursue, of course, her own initiatives, her agenda, use her background, her credibility, her experience, and things that she cares about, because it brings authenticity, of course, to the message, but able to use that platform so widely and have not only the ear of the president, but the ear really of the entire nation, is to work in tandem supporting the overall goals of the administration. Thank you, Natalie. It's a good question.